Alrighty, hopefully everyone had a great lunch. The format of the afternoon is going to be similar to the morning. We're going to have a talk of 45 minutes in duration, followed by 30 minutes for discussion. We're going to have a coffee break and some posters, and then we're going to have another talk. Although Brian Scholl said he'd prefer 5 minutes of talk and an hour and 25 minutes of discussion, so, or however long the period is. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Marina Bedny, who's worked with some of the best people in the field.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you to Marius for organizing and for the organizing committee for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. It's a special honor because I have great, I respect this conference a lot and the people here, and I also find myself in the company of very illustrious speakers, which is extremely lovely. I've enjoyed the talk so far. So today what I want to talk to you about is the origins of functional specialization in the human brain and what we can learn about this question from studying blindness. But before I even get to the issue of functional specialization, I want to kind of zoom out actually and tell you about the two questions that motivate my lab and that motivate this talk. If at some point you can't hear me, wave and I'll start yelling or move the microphone. So the two questions that motivate my research are, how does nature and nurture shape neurocognitive development? And how tightly does neural structure constrain function? You could probably tell immediately that these two questions are interrelated. They're subtly different, but they're also interrelated with each other because to the degree that nature constrains function, it does so through the structure of the brain. I've highlighted the word nurture in the question of how does nature and nurture shape neurocognitive development, but I want to point out that the reason I highlight it is because that's the part of the equation I am most interested in and the stuff that my lab is focused on. That's not a judgment about which one is more important the question is to study both, and my work primarily focuses on the nurture, not to the elimination of the other. Okay, so how does nature and nurture shape neurocognitive development? Well, before I tell you about visual cortex plasticity, where I'm going to be arguing that structure actually constrains function very, very little, I want to tell you a little bit about a place where I think cognition is resilient to experiential change. And so in particular, I want to talk to you about the question of how does sensory experience shapes concepts. This is a question of interest to a great many people, and I think data from people who have different sensory experiences, and in particular people who are blind from birth, is really informative with respect to this question. The logic of all of this research and of this project as well goes like this. We want to know what are the causal variables that drive cognitive and neurocognitive development, but in all of you and in all of us, lots of stuff is confounded. So our experiences are confounded, our evolutionary history is confounded, so can we get some purchase on this question by comparing cognition in people with different developmental experiences, and in particular people who are blind from birth as opposed to people who've grown up with sight. So what I'm going to start with is talking to you about how blind individuals think about vision and light. I think this is an interesting question because it gives us some purchase on the idea of to what degree sensory experience influences concepts. To the degree that sensory experiences influences concepts, and in particular first-person sensory experience, what we would expect is that the concepts of light and vision of people who are blind from birth will be very different from those of the sighted. I take this conceptual domain only because to me it feels like an extreme of a spectrum. There's lots of work along these lines done on objects by Brad Mahone, as well as on action verbs, but I think this is an extreme of a continuum. So the first project I want to tell you about is a very simple experiment we did that's similar to many experiments done in the 70s and 80s, where we asked what blind people know about the meanings of visual verbs. The way we did this is we had congenitally blind participants do a survey online where they would hear two verbs and they had to decide on a scale of 1 to 7 how similar in meaning these verbs were. And we had 6 classes of verbs. There were visual perception verbs, touch verbs, amodal verbs, visual emission verbs, so these are verbs that refer to light events like flicker and blink, and then auditory verbs like beep and boom, as well as a couple of control classes that don't have sensory modality specificity. And so just to give you a flavor for the participants that took part in these studies, the profile of the individuals that take part in our research has actually been going to be consistent throughout the talk. And so it's good to kind of get this stuff out on the table right away. So we work with individuals who are totally blind from birth. They are blind due to a problem with their eyes or the optic nerves, so not due to brain damage, because we're interested in cognition and brain function, and so we don't want to mix the causal variables. These individuals are all totally blind from birth with at most minimal light perception. They've never seen color, shape, or motion by self-report. And they have no, importantly, cognitive or neurological disabilities, okay? So they're screened for cognitive neurological disabilities. In general, we have a mixture of education among our participants. We have people with multiple PhDs, as well as people who have a high school diploma, and our control participants are matched on age and education and gender to our blind participants. So again, as I was saying, in this particular case, we had participants make similarity judgments based on these visual verbs. And so what they did was they decided how similar glimpse was to look, how similar glimpse was to spot. But they also did the cross-modality judgment, where they judge how similar is glimpse to touch. And what we can get out of these sorts of data are similarity matrices, right? We can define the meanings of these words, or we can learn something about the meanings of these verbs by looking at how similar they are to each other. These are the similarity matrices across 3 sighted individuals, just to give you a flavor for what the data look like. They're symmetric about the diagonal. And more red means more similar, and yellow means less similar. And so this is the average similarity matrix across all the sighted participants that took part in the study. The total of the survey took between 6 to 8 hours, and people, the way that they completed the surveys, they would log on online. They would do half an hour, they would log out, and then they would come back and do it whenever they felt like, and they did this over a span of 2 weeks. Okay, so what you can see already by just looking at this matrix is that there's structure that emerges. One of the things that we find in sighted individuals, and actually we also find in congenitally blind individuals, is that they treat visual verbs as a class onto themselves. So even though blind participants they don't see with their eyes, they don't glimpse with their eyes, they don't glance with their eyes, they treat glimpsing and glancing as different from gripping and nudging, okay, and different from amodal verbs. The other thing that we can do is look at kind of the more fine-grained structure of these visual verbs, which I think is more impressive, and we can ask, how similar is the similarity structure of visual verbs among blind and sighted individuals? So what I'm showing you here is a correlation plot where we have a reference sighted group, and we're asking how similar are the similarity ratings among visual verbs between 2 groups of sighted people, and between a group of sighted people and a group of congenitally blind people. And the punchline is that 2 groups of sighted people are as similar to each other as a group of congenitally blind individual is to the sighted. So I think this gives a nice qualitative sense for how similar the meanings of these words are among these individuals. This is a different way to look at the data, so you can ask how correlated are the data of 1 blind individuals to the sighted reference group, and how correlated are the data of 1 sighted individual to the reference sighted group. And you could do that for every individual in your group. And then you could find out how similar are the meanings, again, of blind and sighted individuals. And what I'm showing you here is just to say that the meanings of blind and sighted individuals are as similar in the case of verbs like to stare and to peek as they are for verbs like to grip and to touch, as well as verbs like to notice and to spot. Right? And this is also true, perhaps even more impressively, for light emission verbs like sparkle, glow, and shimmer. So although blind individuals have no first-person access to either light or seeing, the meanings of these verbs seem to be preserved in these individuals. So one of the things that comes up that you might want to think about is like, well, what do blind people know about the meanings of these verbs? What kinds of information do these ratings pick up on? And I can tell you more about that at the end, because these data are extremely rich. But briefly, one of the things that these verbs pick up on is temporal information. So for example, staring takes a long time. It is an intense event. By contrast, glancing is brief. Blind individuals know this kind of temporal information about visual verbs. These are dendrograms from blind and sighted participants showing that among visual verbs, the categories that emerge are similar across blind and sighted individuals. So there's a class of verbs that are persistent and intense, like stare, and there's a class of verbs that are brief, like glimpse and scan and spot, and then some generic with respect to time-looking verbs like see and look. Okay. One other thing that we can ask is, okay, well, the behavior of these individuals is similar, but one thing that there's kind of this angst that comes up for most people when they hear these kind of data. These people are talking the talk, right? They just kind of do these ratings. Who knows what the words actually mean inside their mind? It's just that they're kind of associating the words. And we could talk about what that would mean, but one way that we could look at that question is ask, are they using similar neural mechanisms to think about seeing as people who are sighted? Right? So this is a completely different kind of experiment. In this case, we're not looking at visual verbs. We're looking at reasoning about seeing events, and in particular, beliefs based on seeing. So we had a group of congenitally blind and a group of sighted participants take part in an imaging experiment where they reasoned about how a character felt based on a seeing event, like seeing themselves in a mirror and noticing a stain on their shirt, or a hearing event, like hearing somebody say that they have a stain on their shirt. Or that they look not so well. And so we asked, are blind and sighted individuals using similar neural machinery to reason about the seeing experiences of others? And here I'm showing you the data from the RTPJ, which is part of the theory of mind network, but we looked everywhere in the brain as well, in the entire theory of mind network, but also elsewhere in the brain to see whether we would find similarities or differences among blind and sighted people. And so the answer is that in the case of the theory of mind network and more broadly, blind individuals seem to be using the same neural mechanisms to reason about seeing events. So these are responses in the RTPJ to stories where characters are basing their beliefs on seeing versus hearing, and then control stories that don't involve perceptual or belief experiences at all. And what you see is that both blind and sighted individuals show higher responses to the seeing and hearing stories than to the control stories. Perhaps even more interestingly, when we look at the pattern of activity within the right TPJ, and we ask, can we decode the distinction between seeing and hearing stories based on the pattern of activation in the right temporoparietal junction? So are two stories about hearing more similar to each other than a story about hearing is to a story about seeing? What we find is that both in congenitally blind and sighted individuals, you can decode the difference between seeing and hearing stories. So it's not the case that blind people are not sensitive to this distinction. So every time you say the word see, they think, right? It seems like actually they're encoding the difference between seeing and hearing. They're encoding it neurally in the same way as people who are sighted, and they know what these words mean. Okay, so just to kind of explain the data on the bottom there are within and across category similarities. So the black bar is the cross-category similarity in the pattern analysis, and then the empty bar is the within category similarity. And you can see you can decode the distinction both in the blind and in the sighted group. Okay, so that was a whirlwind before we switched to talking about plasticity. But what I think these data suggest so far is that concepts, or at least some kinds of concepts, the meanings of visual verbs and maybe representations of mental states, are resilient to changes in first-person sensory experience. Okay? So one thing you could conclude from this is that the brain is just hardwired and everything is built in, and their experience just contributes nothing. I think that would be the wrong thing to conclude from these data, and I'm going to try to get some purchase on this question by approaching it from a different direction. So in particular, focusing on how tightly does neural structure constrain function. So how are we going to study this question? As I mentioned to you, experience and innate biology are confounded in all of us. And what I want to ask is, why do particular brain regions have particular functions, right? So the mainstay of cognitive neuroscience, the way that we all kind of earn our daily bread, is by studying the fact that there are different spatially distinguishable parts of the brain that do different things. So the back of the head, the pericalcinoid cortex and the occipital lobe is involved in visual perception. By contrast, there's an auditory cortex. There are parts of the brain that seem to be more involved in processing language, number, cognitive control. And these different neural areas have both different functions, and critically, they also have different structure. So if you take a dead brain and you look at it under the microscope, you find that the cell distributions are different. The kind of pyramidal neurons that you find in V1 and the kind of pyramidal neurons you find in prefrontal cortex are different. The thickness of the different layers are different. And so one natural conclusion, one that I share to some degree, but I'm going to push on today, is that somehow this structure perfectly determines function, right? So if I could look at them under the microscope and I've had perfect understanding of the way that the microcircuitry worked, I would be able to tell you what cognitive functions this brain area could perform, right? So that's on the one end of the extreme. So how do we try to answer this question? To what degree does the microcircuitry and the connectivity constrain the function of a cortical area, okay? Well, one way that I'm going to try to approach this problem is by looking at the development of the visual cortex in people who are blind. So here we have some idea about what this part of the brain evolved for and what it does in people who are sighted. I would argue that we have the best idea of what this part of the brain does of any other part of the brain because we've been studying it for a while. In primates in general, actually in many mammals, the occipital cortex represents spatial information, and in particular, information coming from the eyes, right? So here I'm showing just retinotopic maps in visual cortex. And so this part of the brain is primarily, although not exclusively, driven by input from the lateral geniculate nucleus and in turn by visual information. What does this part of the brain do in people who are blind from birth? So what I'm going to argue is we can gain purchase and understanding the relationship between structure and function by studying this problem. So one idea about what this part of the brain does in people who are blind is that, look, this part of the brain evolved to do a thing. It evolved to do spatial processing. It evolved to do motion perception, a different part of it. It evolved to do fine-grained spatial discrimination. So when there's plasticity in this part of the brain, what's going to change is the modality of input. So now what's going to happen in blindness is it's going to get input from the auditory cortex or the somatosensory cortex, but the computation it's going to perform over that input is still driven by the intrinsic microcircuitry. Motion is going to be motion processing in audition. Spatial processing is going to be spatial processing in audition or touch, right? So this is, I think, reflects actually my intuition and everybody else's, for the most part, intuition about what's going to happen to the visual system. And what I'm going to argue today is that something different happens. So there's a bunch of evidence that in some cases, the intrinsic functions of the visual cortex are preserved in blindness. So I'm giving a bunch of examples here, but there's evidence that the dorsal stream, this is Olivier's work, is involved in spatial processing in audition in people who are blind. There's evidence that MT is involved in motion perception in people who are blind. But what I'm going to give you today is a bunch of evidence that in a large number of cases, or in some cases that we've studied, the function of visual cortex changes dramatically from low-level perceptual processing to high-level abstract cognitive reasoning. Okay. What I'm going to argue today is that in blind individuals, the visual cortex is taken over by higher order cognitive functions, at least in a number of cases, and this is a major mechanism of plasticity in the visual cortex. Why might that be the case? What I'm going to argue is that the visual system is connected to a bunch of cognitive control, prefrontal and parietal areas, and temporal areas, that the primary input coming to the visual cortex is not from other primary sensory cortices, but from secondary higher cognitive regions, right? Although there are some connections from primary sensory areas. And so when you knock out the bottom-up input, what takes over is these higher cognitive functions, right? Okay. So what I'm going to try to convince you of is that in blind individuals, parts of visual cortex are involved in language processing. There are some sub-areas that actually seem to be involved in symbolic number. These are new data that I want to share with you today. And that what happens in blindness is that rather than changing connectivity between visual cortex and primary sensory areas, what increases is the connectivity to secondary higher order cognitive areas in parietal and prefrontal cortex. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the developmental mechanism of these changes by looking both at sensitive periods in late blind as opposed to congenitally blind individuals, and last but certainly not least, data from congenitally blind kids. Okay, so I'm making this outlandish claim, a ridiculous one, I think, which is that blind individuals use their visual systems for language processing. What's the evidence for this idea? So I'm going to start simple, and I'm going to try to provide you with some evidence that blind individuals activate the visual cortex during sentence processing. In this experiment, blind participants listened to sentences, and they had heard a word, and they had to say whether the word came from the preceding sentence. In the most low-level control condition, they would hear the same sentence played backwards, and then a short snippet of backward speech, and they had to say whether the backward speech came from the initial long segment. Okay? And when you compare these two conditions, you say what's more responsive to sentences than backward speech? In blind and sighted individuals, you get this very classic, highly replicable results. Left lateralized, prefrontal and lateral temporal regions activate in both sighted and blind individuals, and there is nothing missing in the brains of blind adults. So it is not the case that they are missing a Broca's area or missing a Wernicke's area. But when you ask the reverse question, which is what are blind individuals activating that sighted people aren't, you get in these two experiments responses to sentences in the visual system of blind individuals. These responses occur both in V1 as well as in lateral occipital cortex and in the fusiform. They don't respect the hierarchy of visual processing. They seem to occur throughout. What I'm going to show you now are responses in V1, just because it's of interest whether in particular this kind of very low stage of visual processing is also recruited for language processing. And indeed, in two experiments, we find larger responses to sentences than backward speech in congenitally blind individuals in V1, but not in sighted people. These responses do not seem to be related to the imageability of the stimuli. Again, this comes up as an intuition for a lot of people. Maybe blind people are spatially processing what's happening in these sentences. There is no relationship between how imageable the sentence is, how spatial it is, and how much the visual cortex of blind people activate to the sentence. But so far, I've told you something very minimal, right? It responds to sentences less than backward speech. The differences between those two conditions are basically infinite, so I won't go there. So one question we want to ask is the visual system actually sensitive to the presence of linguistic information? And so what we did was we degraded the sentence stimuli by removing systematically either lexical information, so having Jabberwocky, like the Dudmore-Plines, Slakapodic Kurthways on her Gagersmoin creedles when they start Snarlesborg without Fethaming. That's a Jabberwocky sentence, so no lexical semantics, but still structure, or removing structural information and keeping the word meanings. And so what you find in classic language areas when you do this to the stimuli is that the language areas like these stimuli best when they have the most linguistic content. So when it's a sentence, you get a large response, that's the dark orange bar, and then there's a staircase reduction in response in left lateral temporal cortex of both sighted and blind individuals. This is, again, a well-replicated classic response pattern. So what happens in the visual cortex of blind individuals? Well, actually the exact same thing. So you get the highest response to sentences, followed by word lists and Jabberwocky, followed by backward speech. You observe this also in V1, not just in lateral occipital cortex, and you don't find any hint of this in people who are sighted. Right? So there seems to be sensitivity to linguistic content, in particular structural and lexical semantic information. So what I've told you about just now is the degrading sentence stimulus, taking away language information. But if the visual cortex is actually processing language, it shouldn't just care whether you make language worse, right? It should also care if you manipulate complexity or you make language richer, right? So this is a completely opposite manipulation that I'm going to tell you about now. So what we did in a recent experiment is we presented blind participants again with auditory sentences. This time they did a yes-no judgment on a question based on each sentence. And we had two kinds of sentences. Sentences with syntactic movement, where there are long distant dependencies between an agent and their property or action in the sentence, and then sentences without syntactic movement that are less complex because there are no long distance dependencies in these sentences. The reason we picked this manipulation is because people who study language have thought that syntactic movement is a particularly interesting linguistic phenomena and may even require specialized cortical machinery for processing. Josip Grodzinski has made this case. And so we asked, is the visual system of people who are blind for birth sensitive to this syntactic complexity manipulation? So first I'm just going to show you the behavioral data from this experiment, replicating countless linguistic studies showing that we get lower accuracy and slower responses for sentences with syntactic movement than sentences without. And the hardest condition in this experiment is the non-words condition, where participants hear a string of non-words and then another string of non-words, and they have to decide if the non-words in the second string are in the same order. The control condition is intentionally difficult because we always want to make sure that we're not getting visual cortex responses in blind people, because that part of the brain just activates for all difficult things. Okay, so these are data from these individuals, from sighted participants and congenitally blind individuals for sentences greater than non-words. And what you see is that, again, replicating the results of the first experiment that I told you, in blind adults, you get both prefrontal and lateral temporal activation, but also the activation extends back into the visual cortex. Again, in this case, I'm circling that activation to show you the lateral occipital cortex. So now we look at region of interest analysis in this part of the brain to see whether we can see effects of the syntactic movement manipulation. And indeed we do, otherwise I wouldn't be showing you these data. So this is percent signal change extracted from the lateral occipital cortex in blind adults. And what you see is a low response to non-words, high responses to both of the sentence conditions, but a significant difference between the plus move and the minus move sentences. Okay? I know that effect looks small, but it's reliable and it's of the same magnitude as it is in Broca's area. So it's a subtle manipulation. Notice that the two sentences mean nearly identical things. They're not perfectly identical, but we've tried to make them, they have almost all the same words and they mean similar things. So these are very tightly controlled stimuli. And this is responses to the same sentences in sighted individuals. We see no hint of a syntactic complexity manipulation. Okay, so one question that always comes up, which I think, to be honest, I have not yet answered and will not yet be able to answer for a couple of years, but I'm going to give you some hints of it, is how is this related to behavior? So one of the things we asked is, are blind people any better at understanding these sentences? The answer is that they are, but I have to tell you, I just don't know why yet. So when you look at blind people's responses to comprehension sentences, to comprehension questions based on these plus move and minus move sentences, they're actually better on both the plus move and the minus move sentences. Both of the sentences are actually kind of complicated. The difference is a little bit bigger in the plus move sentences, but that's not a significant interaction. One interesting thing is that in blind individuals, their performance on these comprehension questions are related to their digit span. So blind participants have a higher digit span than sighted individuals, and that digit span predicts their performance on this comprehension task. So it seems like there's a little bit of evidence that this plasticity may mean something for behavior, but I think the link between the behavior and the plasticity still remains to be made, and we're working on it. Okay. So one thing you might say is, well, is there something special about language, that it's this great invader of all cortical space? Basically, you leave a part of the brain empty, and what's going to go there is language, first of all. Another thing you might wonder is whether there's a special relationship between vision and language. I find this to be a stretch, but maybe. So let's kind of go with this line, right? So language has structure, vision has structure, scenes are hierarchical, sentences are hierarchical. Okay, so the question I'm going to ask is this phenomenon isolated to language, or can we find other higher cognitive functions in the visual cortex? So the thing we looked at next was symbolic number. The reason we looked at symbolic number is because there's a well-studied neurobiological mechanism involved in numerical cognition, namely the interparietal sulcus. This part of the brain has extensive connectivity to the visual cortex in sighted individuals. It's not been looked at in blind individuals, but there's extensive connectivity to the visual system. And again, it's a symbolic higher cognitive domain, which is very different from what vision with the visual cortex typically does. And so if the function of the visual cortex is predicted by what information comes to that part of the brain during development, what you predict is that you might find symbolic number in the visual system. So what we did was we had congenitally blind participants and sighted controls do same different judgment, where they would get an equation like 7 minus 2 equals x, and they had to say whether the value of x was the same in the pair of equations that they heard. And in a control condition, they would get two sentences, one in passive voice and one in active voice, and they had to say whether the meanings were the same. When you compare these two conditions in sighted individuals, we replicate a result that's been found many, many times, which is you get larger responses in the intraparietal sulcus to the math equations than you do to the sentences, right? In blind individuals, you also get the intraparietal sulcus response, but what I'm showing you here is the back of the head. So what you're seeing, in addition to the intraparietal sulcus, you get extensive activation in the visual cortex of blind individuals, greater to symbolic math equations than to sentences. And when you compare the two groups directly in a group by condition interaction analysis, you get larger responses in visual cortex to symbolic number in blind individuals. Again, we want to know more than this is active during the task, right? It's active during the symbolic number task. Is it sensitive to complexity manipulations within this domain? So we manipulated the complexity of the math equations in two ways. One was by manipulating digit numbers. So on some trials, there were single-digit problems. On other trials, there were two-digit problems, so like 27 minus 12. And we also manipulated whether the x variable was isolated on the right side of the equation, or you had to isolate it mentally yourself, okay? And what this does is creates difficult to easy manipulation in the accuracy and in the response time. So now we can ask, is the, for example, intraparietal sulcus, which is kind of our canonical number processing region, not to say that it's the only one, there's others, it's just one that we can measure and localize easily. And so in this part of the brain, you get highest responses to the most complex double-digit and variable, not isolated equations, and then this staircase profile where the lowest response to the easiest variable isolated single-digit equations. You find this in sighted people. You also find the same profile in the intraparietal sulcus of the congenitally blind people. I think this is interesting in of itself. It's another example of preserved function in people who are congenitally blind. So what happens in the visual cortex? I'm going to show you data from the occipital pole now. So in sighted people, makes sense. There are no significant differences between conditions, and the conditions are not particularly active, so you don't get responses to auditory, numerical, symbolic equations in sighted individuals. But in blind individuals, you get robust responses to the task and highest responses to the most difficult equations with a staircase profile with the lowest responses to the easiest equations. Interestingly, the difference between the response to the hardest equation and the easiest equation across people correlates with the amount of activity in visual cortex in people who are blind, but not people who are sighted. Okay, so there's some evidence that these brain regions are not just activating willy-nilly. Again, I will need more data to be convinced that they're related to behavior, but this is a start. So I've told you now about two different functional profiles in visual cortex, right? Parts of visual cortex that are responsive to sentences and their complexity, and other parts that are responsive to symbolic number and their complexity. Are these two different things? Are there actually different sub-regions within the visual system that process these different stimuli, or is the visual system just activating willy-nilly for anything? So here I'm showing you the data I showed you before, which is the response of the occipital pole in blind individuals to the symbolic math equations, and now I'm going to ask, is this part of the brain also sensitive to syntactic complexity? Is it just sensitive to difficulty in general? And the answer is it isn't, right? So it does not respond very much to sentences, and it does not distinguish between sentences with syntactic movement as opposed to sentences without syntactic movement. If we look at the lateral occipital cortex, which is a part of the brain where we often find responses to language, we see the opposite pattern. So no sensitivity to the difficulty of symbolic math equations, and yes, a syntactic complexity effect in this part of the brain. So we're starting to find evidence that there's some functional subspecialization in the visual system of people who are congenitally blind for numerical information on the one hand and linguistic information on the other. Okay, so far what I've told you is that visual cortex is sensitive to higher level linguistic information, including syntax. It's sensitive to symbolic numerical information, and there's some subspecialization within the visual system. So now I'm going to turn to two different kinds of data. I'm going to whiz through it, so hang on with me. One kind of data I want to tell you about is data based on connectivity. So I've made this claim that the reason the visual system is getting reorganized for higher cognitive function is that it's getting input from prefrontal and parietal areas. What am I basing that claim on? And then we'll talk about development. So the first data I want to tell you is about resting state correlation data, right? So we're scanning participants while they're doing no task at all, and we're asking what's correlated with the visual cortex in these individuals. We've done these analyses very many different ways. I'm going to tell you about one particular one, but we can talk about other ways to test the same question. So in the number case, we asked, if we use the intraparietal sulcus as a seed region, what is more correlated with the IPS in congenitally blind as compared to sighted people? And that's what I'm showing you in blue here. It's that part of visual cortex that's more correlated with the IPS in blind individuals. And it overlaps with the part of the visual cortex that responds more to math than language in these participants. When we do a similar analysis in the case of language, we seed an inferior frontal area that responds to sentences, and we asked in blind individuals what's more correlated with this inferior frontal area than in sighted people. You get back the lateral occipital cortex shown in red over there. And again, this part of lateral occipital cortex overlaps with parts of the visual system that are responsive to sentences in people who are congenitally blind. If you do this analysis in a whole brain way, I'm going to not tell you too much about the details of this. What you find is that if you ask across the entire brain, what is correlated more with the visual cortex in blind people as compared to sighted people, what you find is responses in prefrontal areas. That's the biggest effects we see. Also in the parietal cortex, and to some degree in middle temporal gyrus. Okay? What you don't find is increased correlations with auditory cortex or somatosensory cortex. Okay? And so what I would like to argue here is that there's some evidence that the way information gets to the visual system of blind individuals is from these higher cognitive areas in prefrontal and parietal cortex. Okay. So what I'm arguing here is that the visual system is recruited for higher cognition in people who are blind. How does this happen developmentally? So one question that we asked was, is this a phenomena that can happen at any point in life, right? So your brain is just totally flexible all the time. If I blindfold you for the next 5 years, your visual cortex will start processing language. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So we compared responses to language in the visual system of congenitally blind and late blind individuals. So this is the group by condition interaction I showed you before with greater responses in congenitally blind than sighted individuals. And then we asked, what about when we compare congenitally blind to late blind individuals? What you get when you compare congenitally blind to late blind individuals is basically a similar response profile. So the regions shown in yellow are responding more in congenitally blind individuals to language than in late blind individuals. And when you ask, what are late blind individuals recruiting for language processing, for sentence processing in particular, you don't find any responses in visual cortex. So with respect to this phenomena, there seems to be a critical period, okay? The late blind individuals in this particular study were blind since age 9, and so this is region of interest analysis showing no responses more to sentences than backward speech in late blind individuals in V1. And there's actually no relationship between how long you've been blind and how much your visual cortex responds to sentences. So it doesn't seem to have to do with the fact that if you've been blind from 20 to 50, that's not the same as being blind from 0 to 30. Okay, so these data I'm really excited about. They're kind of neat because nobody's ever scanned blind kids before, and now I know why, because it's bloody hard. They're scattered throughout the United States. So these kids flew in. This was a study that I did in Boston. So these kids flew in to the lab. It was a big production, but ultimately we were able to scan 19 children. This was work done in collaboration with Rebecca Sachs, who's crazy for agreeing to do this with me. And so these kids have the same demographic profile as the adults. They're congenitally blind. They have no known cognitive and neurological disabilities, and they're blind due to some problem with the eyes or optic nerve. And so what we wanted to know is when and how does the visual cortex of these blind children get recruited for language processing. But you can't put kids 4-year-old kids in the scanner and play backward speech to them because they will climb out and run away, as they should do. So instead you have to create stimuli that are more child appropriate. So these kids heard stories and they had to they played a game called Does This Come Next? When they would hear a continuation of the story, and they had to say whether it's the right continuation. And in 2 control conditions, they either heard stories in foreign languages they didn't understand or music. And did a similar task where they had to say, is the same language coming next, or is the same melody coming next? These are the behavioral data from these kids. The punchline is the blind and sighted children perform similarly on these tasks. I'm showing you 3 groups because we had a group of blind children, a group of sighted blindfolded children, and a group of sighted non-blindfolded children. Let me tell you, it's fun to scan 4-year-olds while they're blindfolded in the scanner. So these are responses to language, to stories greater than music, in sighted kids in blue and in blind kids in red. So again, as in sighted adults, you get lateral temporal responses to language. You actually get smaller responses in prefrontal cortex to language in blind children. Importantly, when we compare blind children to sighted children directly, you find occipital responses to stories greater than music in the blind as compared to the sighted kids. What's important is that these responses don't correlate with a bunch of things. So if you ask, is the difference between stories and music correlated with Braille reading ability? The answer is no. So this was important to us because we wanted to rule this out as a potential mechanism of plasticity for language in the visual system. This difference is also not correlated with age in these blind children. And so we're scanning kids between 4 and 17, and by the time you're 4, these responses to language seem to be where they're going to be. Okay, in a blind child. These are the same data, but now showing you ROI analysis with, again, greatest responses in the lateral occipital cortex to language, followed by foreign speech and by music in the congenitally blind children, shown in the warm colors, but not either in the sighted blindfolded or the non-blindfolded kids. Okay. So just to summarize what I've talked to you about so far. What I'm going to argue is that the visual cortex is sensitive to high-level linguistic information in people who are congenitally blind. Parts of the visual cortex seem to be recruited for symbolic number. There's different subspecialization within the visual system of people who are blind from birth. We think this specialization comes from higher cognitive areas in prefrontal and parietal cortex, maybe also the temporal lobe, and that the mechanism of this plasticity is direct encroachment during development into the visual system by language, right? So in the case of language, which is the only thing we've studied so far in kids, what we think is happening, not some kind of bootstrapping process where you first learn Braille and then you get these responses to language. We think that there's direct encroachment of prefrontal and lateral temporal areas into the visual cortex, which suggests a very extreme kind of organization, going from low-level visual perception to sentence processing. So what I'd like to conclude, this is the very, very last slide before the acknowledgements, is that just going back to the very beginning of the talk, there's a kind of experience that the brain seems to be very resilient to. So I think concepts are resilient to change in first-person sensory experience. So the minds of blind people, this is consistent with a lot of work that's been done by people here, seem to be very similar to the minds of people who are sighted. By contrast, I think human cortex has a lot of cognitive flexibility. So the same part of cortex, depending on the input that it receives during development, can take on a really wide range of cognitive functions, including low-level vision, sentence processing, and symbolic number. And so what I would like to conclude is that developmental input plays a major role in shaping cortical function. And then I'd like to thank all the people who did this work with me. Yes.
All right, we're going to start here with Mel, and then I have there, and then there's a lot of other hands. Wow. Yeah.
That was a terrific talk. I'm really curious about some people I've been studying, about whether or not they've been inoculated against this encroachment. in cognitive function, and that is self-taught expert echolocators. That is, people who were blind at birth, then learned how to echolocate, and in many ways that echolocation emulates vision to some degree. And in fact, you're probably familiar with some of the stuff that we've done, showing that various areas that seem to be processing things visually in the sighted brain do similar kinds of things with echoes in the blind brain. So I wondered whether or not you found coexistence of, in perhaps some of your 24 people that you mentioned initially who were involved in these studies were echolocators. Were they more or less likely to show the cognitive invasion, or are they somehow inoculated against it?
Right. So I think you're asking a really interesting question that has a specific element to it and a more broad one. I'm going to start with the broad one and just say there's an interesting question about how absence of vision interacts with other experiential factors, right? So humans are really complicated, and you can never change one piece of the experience without changing something else. So they learn how to use a cane, they use Braille, some of them learn how to echolocate, and so how those other experiences interact with plasticity, the answer is we really don't know. So one kind of just thought experiment I like to do with myself is that I certainly don't predict that a blind chimpanzee would have language in its visual cortex, because it has no language capacity at all. So somehow the linguistic experience and the other input coming to that part of the brain has to interact with this question. There is actually, I think, some data showing that actually there are echolocation tasks that activate the parts of visual cortex in blind people. I think there's a little bit of evidence for that. One issue with answering this question is, as you know, a very small proportion of blind individuals are actually echolocators. It's something like 1 in 10. The one other thing I would mention is that I do think echolocation is actually, in humans, is actually very different from, for example, echolocation in bats, right? So a bat, which is what we think of as echolocation.
No, absolutely. And I think that in echolocators, human echolocators, they are indeed recruiting visual cortex, often calcarine cortex, often LO, often perihippocampoid gyrus. And what I wondered was, because it seems as though that recruitment of those visual areas maps very nicely onto what is the normal visual function in a sighted brain, whether or not that somehow protects visual cortex in those individuals, and only those individuals, from language processing and other things of this kind. We find, for example, that blind echolocators develop a much better understanding of the geometry of auditory space from source sounds, right, compared to people who are blind and not echolocators. So there's clearly some sort of substitution going on, sensory substitution, and I wondered whether that, I mean, it's a question you probably can't answer, but I think it would be a really interesting one to pursue.
Right, so I guess the answer is we'd have to look. So the only way to answer that question is to take the same person and test them on these higher cognitive tasks as well as on echolocation.
Absolutely.
My prediction is that it would not protect or change the invasion of it. And
why is that your prediction?
Okay, so one of the reasons I think is that the major patterns of connectivity, I think there's much more in common between blind echolocators and blind non-echolocators than there is different. I think the major connectivity patterns of the brain are what determines what input goes to this part of the brain. I think echolocation is, so one of the things that I was going to say is a bat can see a mosquito, right, and tell which way the mosquito is orienting by echolocation. People who've done these psychophysical experiments in blind echolocators have found that they can't see the shapes of objects at all, right?
That's not true.
Well, I don't know. So Cindy Moss, who studies bats and studies echolocation in bats, brought the guy, I forget, I'm blanking on his name, who's like the head.
Daniel Kish.
Daniel Kish into her lab and tested him in a controlled environment on some of these object perception experiments.
So if
and basically,
honestly, we've done this too. He's actually very good at telling apart shapes and sizes. People who are blind echolocators show size constancy. They show a lot of things. They can tell the difference between materials that are hard or soft on the basis of the timbre of the returning echoes.
People can do that based on sound alone, not just based on echolocation, right? So so based on other sounds echoing off of walls, not just their own.
Absolutely. No, I'm not really challenging you. I'm just suggesting that it would seem at least a possibility
totally
that such individuals would not show as much recruitment as people who are not expert echolocators and blind. That's all.
Yeah.
Right, 2 rows behind you, Mel.
Thanks, really nice talk. I'm trying to fill a gap in my mind, and I was wondering whether you can help me out. So you started your talk by saying that if we only knew the exact underlying microstructure, we could tell what the function of an area was. So if I think of early visual cortex, I'm thinking orientation, I'm thinking spatial frequency, I'm thinking of motion versus non-motion. And so what I'm trying to map here is, why is it that in the blind, how does the mapping of language versus non-language related stimuli or the number processing, how does it map on the functions that we know seem to exist in visual cortex?
Yeah, so I guess I should be very clear about what I'm saying. I'm saying it does not in any way, shape, or form. So what I'm saying is that the microcircuitry of the visual cortex can do low-level visual discrimination of the kind of motion detection and line orientation that you say, and it also seems to be sensitive to syntactic complexity. Now, there's a deep question there, which is, look, maybe this part of the brain evolved for the processing of line orientation, and a really important thing that we need to do next is to show that behaviorally, the visual system can contribute to these higher cognitive functions. So when we apply TMS during sentence processing, are we going to get errors in people who are blind? We're working on that now. But to the limit of what fMRI can measure, what I would argue is that this is a hardware and software distinction, which Mar highlighted for everyone a long time ago, that we've let go too quickly, which is that the same circuit, depending on what information you put into it, is going to do cognitively very different processing.
Okay, thanks.
We're going to go over this side now. So the 3rd row, 3rd in. Thank you.
So getting onto that, the connectivity and how this is kind of wiring up thing. You brought up a little bit in your connectivity that you see this connection between the prefrontal is more connected, functionally connected using those kinds of analyses to the occipital. But this also brings up a little bit about what the limits of functional connectivity and third variable problems, right? So if the temporal lobe or auditory cortex is inputting to both of those regions and it just doesn't know any better, it may just clone the results. So just because you don't see the correlation between auditory cortex and occipital doesn't mean that the input isn't actually coming from there. We know from functional connectivity that it's not always a one-to-one relationship. There can always be a third variable. And that comes up again with the results you showed earlier for both the numerosity and the plus move, minus move data.
Should I answer that question first? Because I think
they go together, so
okay.
Let me just finish real fast. You show some, in both of those sets of data in the fMRI that you put up on the inflated brains, there was stronger activity in the prefrontal cortex in the blind individuals for the tasks that looked about equivalent to the occipital one. And you mentioned, you focused on the occipital, but there was stronger activity in the prefrontal.
Okay, so I'm going to do this one first because it's going to be quick. So the prefrontal responses are just subthreshold in the sighted, and so when we lower the threshold slightly, you get the same thing in the sighted. When we do ROI analysis, you get no difference in prefrontal cortex between sighted and blind. So that's why I'm focusing on that, on the visual cortex, because the prefrontal data are as they are. So the connectivity thing you bring up is really, really interesting and important. So the first thing I want to say is that certainly there's nothing to be concluded from a null correlation, right? I can't say just because these aren't correlated. I can only say that the two things that are increased are not the things that one would predict on that story. But the other piece of your question is, well, how do these functional correlations, for example, relate to anatomy? So I think one fascinating part of the blindness story is that you get these massive increases in correlations between prefrontal and parietal cortex in blind people with the visual system. But what you don't see is increased structural connectivity. People have looked. There are a number of DTI studies looking for increases in connectivity in blindness. They're not looking at these particular tracks because people haven't known to hypothesize that. But to the best of our ability to tell, there isn't a bigger connection happening. And so I think one of the things that's fascinating about these data is that it seems like you can change the function of a connection without changing its structure, right? Which I think is kind of interesting, and we could talk about that as well. Yeah.
Right, just right in front of you.
That was very interesting, thanks. So this goes back to the second to last question. So it's highly speculative. Again, so similar question in a different cloak. So let's just assume the activity you see in visual cortex is not epiphenomenal, but somehow functional and contributes. Let's assume this. And let's assume there is a generic cortical circuitry that is there, but also some specialization of that circuitry. Now, so for numerosity, the IPS does some computation that we don't quite understand yet. But so now it seems like these signals are being propagated through the visual cortex that has a certain different functional circuitry. Now, so I push you to speculate here. You know, is there qualitatively different computation happening in visual cortex and happens in the parietal areas? And you know, is there something that can be added, that visual cortex can add to these things?
Yes.
Do you see behaviorally, qualitatively different things that they do it differently? They have a different spatial resolution, as it were, of those functions as well.
Yeah, and so I think that's a beautiful question, and I think there are multiple pieces to it. So I guess I'll tell you what I think. So one piece of it is to say, is the visual cortex doing the computation the same way? And so one of the points of these experiments is to try to push the visual system to see, can we at some point get some kind of dissociation in the response of prefrontal areas, let's say, and visual areas? Another way to ask that question is there some different spatial architecture in the visual cortex? So for example, there's potentially some segregation between the processing of grammatical and lexical information in language areas. Maybe that segregation is destroyed in the visual system. Maybe the circuit is actually doing the job less well. And so actually blind people, I mean, a prediction, just to give you a sense for how little we understand about the structure-function relationships, I don't think it would be impossible to suppose that you get deficits in some cases because the information is being processed in visual cortex. But another way to ask that with fMRI is to say, look, all of the cases you've shown me, the visual system is behaving just like some other part of the brain. So there's one piece of data that I didn't tell you guys about that we just recently collected that looks different, just as an example of a case where it's clear that something is being processed there, some transformation. So when we look at Braille reading in the visual system, we get a bunch of regions in blind individuals that respond more to Braille words than auditory words, and more to Braille words than consonant strings, and more to those two intermediate conditions than either auditory noise or nonsense Braille. So there's some interaction between the fact that they're words and the fact that they're coming through the tactile modality. We see these responses also, again, not respecting visual boundaries. We see they're nowhere else in the in the brains of blind people. So in that case, anyway, it seems like there's something different in what this part of the brain is doing than anything else. But I think what you're asking is the right kind of question, and we just need to make more progress in trying to figure it out. Yeah.
All right, we're coming back over here.
So quite provocative, quite interesting. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll only ask maybe one. How do I want to phrase this? What do you make if it seems that there's a little, across your studies, it was hard to know which functions being performed in calcarine cortex? And is it because there's a deactivation? So in the children's study, for example, it looks like the kids are deactivating, whatever that means, versus the blind. And so how do you get a cohesive story out of this?
Right. So I'll tell you. Yeah. So, go ahead. Is that?
Almost. And how do you reconcile with some of the animal work, let's say from Reganka Sur and others?
Another beautiful question. Yeah.
Where there is structural changes and functional changes that seem to happen in the case of early blindness.
Okay, so I'm going to go with the first question. So you were asking me about what happens in V1, and so I'll just tell you, the answer is I don't know, but I'll tell you what I do know. What I do know is that we consistently get differential responses in V1 relative to, let's say, lateral occipital and fusiform cortex in some studies. So it looks like the functional pattern is different in V1 and different within V1. So we get different responses in peripheral V1 and foveal V1. So if we do like a functional localizer in a V1 and we say which part of the V1 responds to language versus which responds to numerical processing, we get different subsets. So I don't think there's a single story. With respect to the developmental data, it looks like actually, I mean, one rich interpretation of those data is that developmentally, you first get reorganization in the secondary visual areas, and then it gets to the visual cortex with the V1 because it's coming anatomically from those areas. So one interesting possibility is that the way that the information flow goes is secondary, higher cognitive areas to secondary visual areas in turn to V1. But the answer is, I don't know yet what it's doing, but it does seem to have its own profile relative to other parts of the brain. With respect to the Reganka-Sur studies, one thing is that I think those studies are some of my favorite science experiments of all time, the rewiring ferret studies, right? So here's where they're taking the visual thalamus and rewiring it into the auditory thalamus, and they find columns in the auditory cortex, cortical columns in the ferrets. So I think those studies are beautiful of demonstrating plasticity, but I think the analogy between what happens in those studies breaks down with humans, right? They are causing the rewiring, right? So they are taking in a totally underdeveloped ferret because they're born in an earlier stage of development and plugging stuff into another part of the brain. So while I think the analogy tells us something about the flexibility of a cortical circuit, I don't think it tells us anything about the long-range connectivity that underlies the plasticity in humans, both because they're doing the rewiring, but because also the long-range connectivity of the human brain is very different from a ferret's. It's actually even different from a chimpanzee. They don't have Broca's area, so I think we have to study humans to get that part of the story. That's what I would say.
Alfonso, did you?
Oh, thank you. Beautiful, Marina. I have a beautiful question because it's similar to yours. So if that's beautiful, mine's will be beautiful too. First, a simple question about laterality. You didn't dwell on it. You didn't show us always both sides of the brain. Perhaps you can tell us whether their response is lateralized.
There, yeah.
But my question really was, you didn't tell us what the computations carried out in this part of the brain are. You seem to be hinting that they are the same as other parts of the brain, so that what you've done is, if there are areas that are specialized for syntactic processing, for the sake of argument, that area now has been expanded to include visual cortex. Okay, that's one hypothesis, and that's perhaps what you believe. Alternatively, it could be that, in fact, that's not the case, that there's a sort of spillover space that can be used for holding information active while you're engaged in processing. And you did hint, perhaps you were trying us to make us believe your story more clearly by showing us that the blind seem to be superior in performance than the sighted in a task that may require greater attention, because these guys are blind and perhaps they've learned to attend more to auditory speech. I have no idea why, but you showed us data that the blind perform better than the sighted. And I was curious about why that is happening. It could be because of either superior syntactic, say, semantic processing, or it could be because of greater processing space resources. So even the example of the move sentences, it's not clear that that's a syntactic process. It could be the outcome of syntactic process that then involves semantic interpretation, semantic integration, and all those things. Okay, so that's the question I think that Johan asked you. I'm asking it a little bit differently, but do you have any hypothesis about what is going on? And do you truly believe that what you've done is you've taken the language system, whatever it looks like, and you've duplicated it in visual cortex? Or are you putting there just the outcomes, the outputs for, say, for memory processes, for integration? So they're not linguistic processes as such, but those processes associated with language processing.
Right. So what I...
Mine is not a beautiful question?
You already said it was beautiful. I don't need to tell. So here's what I would say. I would say that it is more scientifically productive to pursue the strong hypothesis, to hypothesize, to me, I think, that what quacks like a duck probably is a duck. So if the functional profile of these areas is indistinguishable from other brain regions, which we are willing to say are doing sentence processing or numerical processing, then we have to have some reason besides our pre-theoretical kind of thoughts to say that, yes, they're behaving exactly the same way, but so I'm going to, right. But actually I'm going to posit that they're doing different things. That having been said, it's by no means resolved, right? It's just not. And so for my part, I think what's a productive strategy is to push to those extreme functions that we can see whether they're actually being processed in the visual cortex. Is the visual cortex necessary for these high-level functions? The most controlled experiments that we can do. And if we run into a limit at some point, well, that would be extremely interesting. So the answer is, I don't know the answer to the question yet, but I'm going to pursue this direction.
But I'm not sure what the question is. Would you predict, is your claim that if one were to know how language is processed in the brain, and so that there are, say, differentiations between morphosyntactic processing, phonological processing, that kind of organization is duplicated in the visual cortex? Or is that what do you call the strong hypothesis? Or is the strong hypothesis simply that it's involved in language? That's not a strong hypothesis.
I think that there's a spectrum of hypotheses, really, right? It's not the case that the only thing that makes something a language area is the segregation between morphosyntactic processing and sentence processing, because if that were the case, most of the brain regions that you damage to get aphasia wouldn't meet that criteria in fMRI studies, right? And so I think there's going to be a complex story, right, there about in what ways is the way that the visual cortex contributing to language processing similar to what, let's say, Broca's and Wernicke's area does. What I will say right now is that it's much more similar than what I expected when I started doing these experiments. However, there's much more work to be done, and it's possible that we will run an experiment that will say, so the hypothesis I'm pursuing right now is that it's contributing specifically to language processing. It's being invaded by brain regions in the temporal or prefrontal cortex that do language processing, and it's incorporated into that circuit, at least for part of it. That's the hypothesis I'm pursuing right now. Whether there are other things going on, or maybe that isn't going on, the experiments we're running will answer that question, I think. Should I answer the laterality question, or should I? Yeah, so there's actually an interesting story there. We're actually writing a paper right now about language laterality and blindness. And the story goes like this. With the first experiments that we ran on sentence processing in blind people, we saw left lateralized responses, maybe a little less left lateralized than in sighted individuals in the entire brain, right, in the prefrontal and temporal cortex. We've now seen it in multiple data sets. In blind individuals, there is a smaller tendency to have left lateralized language in Broca's and Wernicke's area. And to the degree, but visual cortex follows wherever language is lateralized. So if you have language on the left, it's going to be language responses on the left. If you have language on the right, it's going to be on the right. So I think there's an interesting question there why that happens. This relates to Marlene's talk and questions about what are the origins of laterality in the human brain. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, right
here. Thank you. This was a really complex talk. And you presented some complex hypotheses, but I am tempted to throw in a simple hypothesis, and it'll be easy to throw it out. And this is, what if You showed us at the beginning the fact that congenitally blind people can understand very well differences between glimpse and stare and all these things. So what if the activation of the visual cortex was processing in a visually compatible format what is coming presumably as an explanation verbally from somebody else who's telling these people or told these people when they learned. A glimpse is a very short look. A stare is a long, intense look. In other words, what if you're seeing the mental visual representation of a verbal explanation that these people received during their life?
So I would kind of throw this back at you a little bit and say that is an extremely complex hypothesis and not a simple one, because what you're positing is that these people who've never seen process visual information in their visual system, and I think that's kind of complicated. But what I will also say is we've looked at sentences that have no spatial or visual information. It's not like we're testing blind participants in these experiments on does the sun glow. These are sentences like, you know, Mary believes that tomorrow she needs to take an exam.
I mean, you can represent this as a visual...
Right, but the thing is that there has to be some prediction, right? There has to be something like, I predict that the visual stuff is going to get more responses than not. Otherwise, it's just an explanation for any data set. And so far, I don't see any evidence for this hypothesis in all the ways that I've tested. But if somebody thinks of another one, I'll do it.
All right, we have one more over here. Third row there. Marlene, if you know who she is.
Thanks. My question actually overlaps a lot with what other people have asked, but I'll try push one step further. So you've argued that you see all this activation in visual cortex, and there is subspecialization for language versus numbers, and you see differences depending on whether they're early blind versus late blind in the extent of this. My suggestion is that what you're picking up is the cascade of the bidirectional connectivity between multiple brain regions, so there are recurrent circuits, in the absence of visual input that dampen down or fine-tune visual cortex to be only sensitive to visual information. You have the opportunity here to amplify the feedback from these connected areas, and you show us the connectivity. But the claim or the hypothesis that I guess I'm suggesting is that this is the knock-on effect, this is the cascade, and there actually is no computational contribution of these early areas. So the prediction I think that one would make is that in a blind individual, a lesion to V1 under your hypothesis would give rise to Broca's aphasia or some other form of aphasia or acalculia, and in my case, probably not.
So I think actually that prediction is a little complicated because, you know, there's a question about do these people have a more distributed system? So now if you lesion Broca's area, maybe they won't get aphasia in the same way that a person, right, so we don't know exactly. I will tell you the evidence that there is that the visual cortex is functionally relevant to stuff in blind people. So Amir Mehdi has a really lovely TMS study that you might know about where he stimulated the occipital pole and was able to get verb generation errors in people who are congenitally blind but not in people who are sighted. There's an early study by Laurent Cohen on Braille reading in blind individuals, stimulating the visual cortex and getting errors on Braille reading in blind individuals. So it doesn't seem like this part of the brain is just activating without any particular function. That having been said, the mechanism that you talked about, which is this idea of this kind of disinhibition or something of the visual cortex, I think there may be some truth to that. So it's possible that part of the mechanism of plasticity is that in sighted people, what the visual cortex learns, in part over development, is that its activity is correlated with itself and not with other stuff. And so it should do something coherent and not do anything in particular when there's auditory stimuli going on. In fact, we get dampening and activation, time-locked auditory stimuli in sighted people in this part of the brain. But in blind individuals, that changes, right? Their visual system is learning, I'm gonna I'm going to work with the Broca's area, right? That's my function. So whether that's one of the mechanisms of this plasticity, I don't know how to test that yet, but I think it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
So you think you can get failure after the one lesion?
So as I said, I don't know, because I don't know yes. So I do think that in principle, so what we're doing right now is running a TMS experiment where we're going to stimulate lateral occipital cortex and see if we can get syntactic errors. So that gives you a sense of what I think. But I'm not sure whether what you might get is no deficit with Broca's or visual cortex stimulation. So we're going to have to find out, right? But I do think it's functionally relevant.
No, sorry, it's up here. Sorry. Up here. He's been waiting a long time. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, no? Okay. Oh, she already answered it? Okay. We have okay, fine.
Okay, actually it's not a question. I would have loved to ask this beautiful question before, but it's a comment on your question. Actually, there is one case in the literature published by Hamilton, right? So this stroke in the occipital cortex, this woman, professional Braille readers, after the stroke develop Braille alexia. So basically,
yeah, I guess all I can say is that I think that's complicated, right? It's like a case report with no description of the experiment or exactly who this person was, and I find those data not particularly compelling, but sorry.
All right, before we thank Marina again for a great talk, I want to, before we do, I want to please ask that everyone be back promptly at 4:15. Brian's already said he wants to only give a 5-minute talk, so if you're late, you're going to miss it. And then thank you, Marina.